Good morning. How is everyone doing this morning? Good. So last week, Pastor Chris came and he shared with us about the importance of commitment in our faith. Unless we take a stand and commit following in our convictions with action, then we will not be able to accomplish the things that God desires for us as individuals and for us as a church family. Complete and total commitment requires us to reevaluate everything about our lives. Many of us live our lives busy, very, very busy, like that VeggieTales song, with Flibberoloo and Gibberty Lot. Frightfully busy, right? Much too busy for you. This is the attitude that a lot of us have when it comes to what God is trying to do in our lives. We've loaded our lives up to the limit, and we simply have nothing left over for Christ. Now, in my life and in yours, if we don't build in a margin, then we are going to be completely overwhelmed by our lives, and frankly, we are going to disqualify ourselves from the ministry that Christ is calling us to do because we don't build in the time to make it happen. Now, margin, what do I mean by margin? Margin is just the space between my load and my limit. In other words, as we realistically and critically evaluate how much time we have, how much money, how many resources we have, what is left over after we factor in our commitments. And as we evaluate these things, we need to have enough left over for Jesus to work with. But margin is not just about cutting things out of your life. It's also about filling things back in. So margin does not look like coming home from a week of work. You're doing 80 hours at work, and then you come home and you put in a Red Baron pizza, you sit in front of the TV, and you watch your favorite show for the rest of the night, and you do that over and over and over again. That appears to demonstrate margin, because at the end of the day, you've got time with nothing planned. You can just sit there, you can enjoy a pizza or whatever. And believe me, I've had my fair share of Red Baron pizzas. But that isn't margin because we are not building time in for significance, but for selfishness. You see how in that example, the margin was filled with self-indulgence instead of with significance. And that is the purpose of our margin, is not so we can fill it with more things for us, so that we have the space in our finances and in our time to do the things that God is calling us to do. In our culture today, we have this tendency to work ourselves to death. We work and we work and we work. We grind and grind and grind at that grindstone, and then we take a self-care day, the kids are calling it these days, which, if we're being honest with ourselves, for many of us, a self-care day is really a self-indulgence day, right? It's a time when we throw the rules out. I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm going to spend however much I want because today I'm going to care about me, right? Has anybody seen this happening all around us today? It's terrifying to me because that's not what God has called us for, is it? God has called us to build margin into our day, into our week, into our year, so that we don't get burnt out like that. It's so important that we build some margin in so that we have the energy to do what's most important, the things that He has called us to do. Margin isn't just about cutting things out of our lives, out of our schedules, or reducing your spending. It's about making the time and the financial space for what matters most. God made us with a purpose and a plan for each of us individually and for us as a church family. And if we keep adding in these pork barrel activities that are designed to appease our friends or to please our neighbors, then we are filling out our time and our space with things that could otherwise be used to make a real difference in God's kingdom. We're constantly saying, I can fit one more thing in, but if we fit one more thing in over and over and over again, pretty soon there's no space left for the big things. I'm reminded as I was preparing for this sermon of of God's sovereignty, his perfect timing. And about a year ago, Adam Swigert gave me this book. I was talking to him about some things going on in my life, and he said, I really think you should read this book. Somebody told me to read this book, and it's been really helpful to me. And so I took it, and I said, well, full disclosure, Adam, like my to-read stack is pretty high. It's like that big. So it might be a year or so before I get around to reading it. He's like, nah, that's okay. You go ahead and take it. And so he gave me this book called Essentialism, and I started it. I got about a quarter of the way in when Pastor Chris told me I was going to be presenting on this topic of the foundational things in our faith. And here's just a couple little quotes from this book. It's called Essentialism. It says, Essentialism is not about how to get more things done. It's about how to get the right things done. The way of the essentialist means living by design and not by default. Right? That's a key concept. We live by design, not by default. And as we are removing the cluttering things from our life to make time for what's most important, we have to be able to discern what is essential from what is not. And there are many non-essentials. There are many, many trivial things, and there are few essentials. But as we cut these superfluous things out, we are making space, as I said, for God to work in our lives to do what matters most. And this applies to us as a whole church, right? It applies to our individual lives, but it also applies to us as a church. We can't do everything here at LUMC. No church can. So as we are prayerfully discerning what God is calling us to do, if each of us have made margin in our lives in order to fulfill his calling for our church, then collectively we will all have the energy to do it. We need to focus our efforts individually and as a congregation if we really want to make a difference for our community. Now, many of you know me pretty well. You'll know that both my parents are teachers. My dad teaches history. My mom teaches math. And if you looked at my report cards from junior and senior high school, you'd notice that I take much more after my dad than after my mom. I never did super well in math. I did okay, but I didn't really care too much for doing the problems and learning the stuff. But ironically, I do find it interesting whenever I read about or I learn about unusual mathematical concepts or things that have an odd explanation or unsolvable problems, things like that. And my mom and I, from time to time, will send each other these videos. If I see one, she'll send it to me. If she sees one, she'll send, or you know what I mean. We'll send them to each other. And she sent me this video probably a couple years ago now about this building in London. It's the 20 Fenchurch Street building, and the locals have a derogatory name for it because they think it's ugly. They call it the walkie-talkie building. And that's it, the big one there on the left. But there's something very unusual and interesting about the 20 Fenchurch Street building. They noticed when it was almost completed being constructed, they noticed across the street that a Jaguar car had melted. They noticed that a doormat in a local shop across the street had caught on fire. I've got your attention now, don't I? So there's something really interesting about this 21st Street building. Go ahead, Andrew, put up the next picture. The way that the building is curved and the reflective nature of the windows, it takes in the rays from the sun and it focuses them all in one particular range on the street across. Now, this only happens for a couple hours every day, a couple weeks out of the year, but they have had to install reflective proof film on those windows to prevent anything dangerous from happening across the street, because this building has taken the source of light that has come into it and it has focused it to where it's setting doormats and cars on fire. Now, can you imagine if we as a church congregation, if all of us were like those windows and we take the time and the resources that God has for us and we focus them all in one place, we could light the world on fire, couldn't we? Yeah, that's right. I just think that's a really cool little story. And it illustrates well how effective focus is, right? How effective, you could use the magnifying glass example as well. But we need to get back to the basics, right? We need to focus starting at square one. And the Apostle Paul wrote these words to the church at Ephesus. He says, I ask God to make your eyes focused and clear so you can see exactly what God is calling you to do. And this is my prayer for us all today. This is the prayer of our church leadership, that we can focus on what really matters. And so we are entering into a short 2-week series about foundational questions. We're going to do 2 questions this week, and Pastor Shrum is going to share with us 2 questions next week about how we do that. How do we take the resources and the time that we've been given, and we use them with laser focus so that we can accomplish just a couple things really, really well and to God's glory, rather than getting practically nothing accomplished at all. Right? If you stand out in the sun, none of the rays of the sun are focused enough to kill you, right? They wouldn't do you any harm. They wouldn't burn you or melt you. But just like that walkie-talkie building, or they call it the walkie-scorchy building now, by the way. But just like that walkie-talkie building, if all of us are able to focus our effort in just a couple places, then it'll be much, much more effective than if we have dispersed our efforts all over the place. So, this week we're going to be looking at 2 questions. We're going to be looking at what the center of my life is going to be, and then we're going to be looking at what is going to be the character of my life. And these are foundational questions for a reason, because the answer to these questions for each of us individually is really going to be the most important thing about us in many ways. If you answer these questions in a way that I hope that you will, and as we're going to talk through this morning, then it can lead us to making a difference, not just here in Latrobe community and beyond, here in the 21st century, but we can have an impact that is effective for things that will matter in eternity. Right? Not just in the 21st century in Latrobe, but we can make disciples and we can mature them and we can send them out into the world to multiply the disciples of Jesus, and it'll matter 100,000 years from now, 1 billion years from now, in eternity. These things are going to matter. So that's why these questions are so important. So the first question we're going to ask this morning, what will be the center of my life? In other words, who or what am I going to live for? What is going to occupy the throne of my heart? What is that thing in the middle that everything else I do and say revolves around? See, if everything that we do and say can be traced back to that center of our lives, the center of our hearts, that really is the most important thing about us, isn't it? In fact, whatever you have placed at the center of your life is the God of your life. And we have many options to choose from, don't we? We've got our careers, we've got our hobbies, our wealth, social status, appearance, possessions, family identities, accomplishments, sexual expression, and countless other things to choose from. They are vying for our attention, and none of these are necessarily bad things. These are all gifts from God. Inherently, there's nothing wrong with them, but they become miserable gods. If we put them at the center of our lives, it's going to completely warp everything else about us. And here's something that I learned from a pastor named JP. He says, good things become bad things when they become ultimate things. Good things become bad things when they become ultimate things. If you take something that's inherently good, something that is a gift from God, but if you make it the ultimate thing in your life, if you put it right in the center, then it's going to totally mess up everything else, isn't it? You think that money will provide you with security, but that's certainly not the case. I mean, here's what the Bible says. It says in Psalm 62, if your wealth increases, don't make it the center of your life. Jesus said a man's life does not consist of the abundance of things that he possesses. And what he means there is that just because you have something and you desire it does not mean you should put it at the center of your life, because there's only one thing that fits in the center of your life, right? There's a hole in our hearts that can only be fit, that only one thing can fit into. In the book of Ecclesiastes, in the first 2 verses of the entire book, it says, meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What a depressing way to start a book of poetry, a book of wisdom. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. But what he's saying there, he's saying, I've searched the world for meaning, and I've searched the world for what our purpose is here on earth, and the rest of it is garbage. He says it's meaningless. Our careers will end. Our hobbies will lose their excitement. Wealth will be lost. Appearances will fade. Possessions will be destroyed. Accomplishments will be forgotten. And us? Our life isn't going to last forever, is it? Our time here on earth is limited. We have to make wise decisions about what we're going to fill the center of our life with. Meaningless. All of those things are meaningless. But if you want your life to have any stability whatsoever, any structure, any sense of purpose to it, we have to choose a centerpiece that does not falter, does not fade, it does not change. Again, those things are all fine. They're all gifts from God. But if we put created things at the center of our lives, then we are going to miss out on the blessings and the joy that comes from putting the Creator at the center of our lives. There's only one true God that can occupy our hearts, and it is the big G God, right? It is the one true God. When I was at Grove City, I attended this class, and one of the professors said something that kind of stuck with me, that kind of characterizes what is going on in 21st century America. He says this, he said, God intended for us to worship at our worship, to work at our work, and to play at our play. But instead, we worship our work, we work at our play, and we play at our worship. Right? Doesn't that describe what we see in the world around us right now? That we have completely upended the structure that was designed for our lives by replacing God at the center. But it doesn't have to be that way, does it? Whenever we become Christ followers, whenever we put Christ at the center of our lives, everything changes. It's like a complete reorientation of our lives, and putting Christ at the center of our life means that he is not just one slice in our pie, right? If we were to divvy up our life into slices of pie with different sizes for different importance, it wouldn't be that, we got a nice big chunk for family, a nice big chunk for our job, and there's a nice big chunk for you too, Jesus. No. Jesus is not just another slice of our pie. If he's the center of our life, he is the pie, right? He's the whole pie. He gave us our lives. They belong to him, and we are to do everything in our lives for him. So it's not like Jesus gets a slice of pie. Well, my slice of pie is this big, and my slice of pie is bigger. That's my Jesus slice of pie. No. Jesus gave you the pie. The whole pie is his. He is everything that we have been given, and he should be a part of everything that we do. So as you divide up your life for your job and your family and other things that are important and good things, make sure that his name is written on every single slice of pie, because it all belongs to him, and we're all to use it for him. Now, here's a spoiler from the end of Ecclesiastes, so I'll save you the trouble of going through all 12 chapters to figure out what his purpose was and what he found. But the author says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. You know who wrote that? Anybody? Go ahead, Mrs. DeRazio. I know you know it. Solomon, right. Solomon, the richest guy to ever live by some people's calculations, the wisest guy to ever live except Jesus, according to the Bible. And he searched everything. I mean, this is a guy that had it all. You talk about a wealthy business owner. He had access to forestation and to mines like you wouldn't believe that increased his wealth. He had, several thousand wives? Yeah. This is a guy that literally has it all. And what is he saying? He says that stuff is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. What matters, the conclusion of the matter, he says, is to fear God, to keep his commands. That is our duty. That is where the center of our lives is supposed to be. Everything else will fall into place if we make him that center. But Jesus promised us that we would have trouble in this world, didn't he? He didn't say that everything would be easy all the time, but one of the things that indicates that we have put Jesus at the center of our lives is that we don't have as much anxiety about those things, right? Life can be a roller coaster. It's got his ups and its downs. But if you are convinced, if you believe that Jesus is sitting in the roller coaster next to you, I mean, it's not so bad, is it? You know that you're going to have hard things happen to you. You know that bad things will come about. But you know that no matter what you do, no matter where you are, God is right there with you, and that he's sovereign over that whole situation. If Jesus is at the center of our lives, we can see the world through that lens. When I was preparing for this message, Pastor Chris told me, he said, anytime I start worrying, it's a red flag. He said, it's a flashing light, a warning sign to me that says I've allowed something or someone to become the center of my life instead of God. The number one stress reliever in our lives is believing with confidence that Jesus is with us. By placing him at the center of your life, you can live a life that is significantly more peaceful, more joyful. Here's another litmus test for what we have placed at the center of our lives, and this one could be a little bit dangerous, but here we go. You want to think about, in the last 24 hours, what have you spent the most time thinking about? Right? We've got a lot of options. It might be your job, it might be your grandkids, or golfing, or the stock market, or where your next beer is going to come from, or your next date, right? These are things that vie for our attention. Well, whatever you think about the most is an excellent indicator for what's at the center of your life. All right? And I know this is certainly true for me. As I'm thinking through this message, it occurred to me earlier in this week, we play a card game called Magic. Some of the young adults and some of the youth kids play this game, and it's a lot of fun. And there's a lot of things you can do with it as you're putting your card deck together. You want it to be extra good so that it'll beat everybody else's. And I was thinking earlier this week on Monday a lot about an idea that I had for a deck that I thought would be really cool and really fun and really good. And on Tuesday, as I'm thinking through this message and I'm thinking through this practice, what have I thought about the most in the last 24 hours? I thought about Magic on Monday, I think, more than I thought about Jesus. And that was scary to me. And I was like, oh no, what have I done? I got to be prepared to practice what I'm about to preach. And so I felt led to share you that story today because it's so important to think about what the center of our life is going to be the most. Whatever is at the center of our life, if we choose Jesus is going to be the center of our life, then we have to be prepared to be thinking on what that means for ourselves every day. Now, there's a reason why I just said 24 hours, right? And you can put this in your margin. I'd encourage you all to write this in, to practice this later today, and just take a couple minutes to think about what have I thought about the most in the last 24 hours. But there's a reason why I picked 24 hours. That was purposeful. That's because choosing the center of your life is a daily decision, right? As we accept Jesus, as he comes into our hearts and into our lives, then we are saved. That is a lifelong decision if we are saved by Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross. But actively, as we live our lives, it is a daily decision to put him at the center of it. Right? Have you ever removed Jesus from the center of your life and noticed that everything just kind of wobbles and nothing's running very smoothly, but you put him back in place and it all makes sense again? I mean, that's happened for me. For sure, that's happened to me. Choosing to follow Jesus, choosing to make him the savior of your life is going to be the most important decision that you ever make. But choosing to put him at the center, to make everything else that you do about him, that's going to be the most consistently wise decision that you can make. And if you haven't chosen to put Jesus at the center of your life, then I would encourage you to just say this simple prayer right there in your seat. It's as simple as saying, God, I want Jesus to be at the center of my life. I want to know him as Christ and to put him at the center. But in order for God to focus our lives, to focus our effort, we have that first question to answer: what will be the center of my life? And then the second question is, what will be the character of my life? Right? What kind of person am I going to be with the time that I have here on earth? Once we've determined what the center of our life is going to be, this is the next logical question. Because the center of our lives determines the character of our lives. God is much more interested in our character, the content of who we are, of the content of our character, than he is in the content of our resume. Right? Our accomplishments are not going to matter in eternity, save for what we accomplished through Jesus for his kingdom here on earth. And we can only do that if we've put him at the center of our life and we've developed our character to reflect his. No achievement here on earth can save you from a fate in hell for all eternity. In fact, I would contend that if you ended up in hell for all eternity, it was because you thought you could get to heaven from your own accomplishments and from the content of your resume. But we as followers of Jesus know that it's nothing that we've done to save ourselves, don't we? It's Jesus' work that covers our sins. And yet, if you're in heaven and you acknowledge that, it is still a lifelong process for us to be conformed to Jesus' image. And our character is the only thing about us that we will take with us into eternity. We're not going to take our accomplishments. We're not going to take anything but who we are in our character. And God is developing our character now in preparation for eternity. And God is very clear about what he desires for our character. He gives us a clear example for what our character should look like through Jesus. Here's what Romans chapter 8 says. It says, "From the very beginning, God decided that those who came to him should become like his Son." In other words, God has expectations for our character because we bear his image, right? Now, when I was a kid, I was involved in a lot of different activities. I did baseball. I did aqua club, so I swam with the aqua club. I did violin lessons, drum lessons. I did the musicals. I did choir. I went on play dates with friends, right? And whenever we would go to these various things, my parents would always tell us, now, remember that your character, that your behavior does not only reflect upon you, right? I heard this probably more than my sisters did because I was a troublemaker. But our character and our behavior doesn't just reflect on us, right? Did anybody else hear that when they were a kid? Now, essentially what that's saying is if you misbehave, you're not the only one who looks bad, right? And I heard this a lot, again, because I had a tendency to misbehave. But anyway, that's beside the point. But this is kind of what God is saying to us through the example of his son Jesus. He says, if you are going to bear my image, if you are going to be called by my name, if you are going to call yourselves little Christs, then you need to remember that your behavior reflects not just on you. It reflects on the God that you say you worship. It reflects on other people who call themselves by his name. And isn't it wonderful that God sent us an example, a human example, of what that character is supposed to look like? Now, I can imagine his frustration only in part because I'm sure that it is far greater than anything we can imagine. But I can imagine him up in heaven saying, I'm giving you everything you need, but you still can't follow me. So he decided, fine, I'm going to send my son. He's going to be human just like you, and he's going to show you the way to do it. In the flesh, in person. You won't have any excuses after that. And so he sends Jesus, and Jesus teaches us the right way to live in his time here and he is our model. And this process of sanctification means that we learn to adopt Jesus' character traits as our own. And we've all got particular sin struggles that we have to deal with. But some of us might be thinking about these sin struggles and saying, there's no way that God understands what I'm going through. There's no way. Nobody else can understand. This is such a unique temptation. This is something that only I have to deal with. It seems like I can't overcome it. It's much harder on me than it is on everybody else. But that's not true, is it? No, that's not true. We can receive comfort from Hebrews chapter 4. It says, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So you know what that means? That means Jesus gets it. He understands. As you are going through these hardships, through these temptations, through these things that you don't think anybody else can relate to, I think Jesus is beside you. He's saying, man, I get it. I understand. It hurts and you're lonely. I understand. I've been lonely. I know that you're in pain and that really stinks and it is leading you toward bad thoughts, but I'm telling you, I've been there. It's way better to choose not to give in to those temptations. We're going to face difficulties in this life. But God has been there. God sent his son Jesus to experience these things and to show us the potential of our character through him. And there's this urgency about it, right? There's this urgency whenever the Apostle Peter writes in 2 Peter chapter 1, he says, don't lose a minute in building on what you've been given, complementing your basic faith with good character, spiritual understanding, alert discipline, passionate patience, reverent wonder, warm friendliness, and generous love. In a way, what he's saying there is, stop waiting for the right opportunity. The right opportunity is never going to come along. You think, well, if I'm only in the right situation, then I could really be patient. I could really be loving. I could really show that person the love of Jesus. It's funny. I'm laughing because I have seen in my own life, at least, this tendency that whenever we are lacking in a particular area of our spiritual character, that God will often put us in a situation that challenges that, right? That it tends to elicit the opposite response. So there's no sense in waiting for the right circumstance, because if you are lacking in the point of, say, alert discipline, God is going to put situations around you that give you the chance to develop alert discipline. He might put you in situations where the enemy has tempted you toward self-indulgence or toward laziness, passivity, whatever it is, so that you have the opportunity to choose discipline, to choose Jesus' character as your own. And there are examples for that for all of the others listed there in 2 Peter 1, or in the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control or discipline. And it occurred to me in this message while I was preparing that if God never tested our character, how would we know that we're making any progress? Right? And it seems odd. Well, why would he test our character? Well, you think about it, we've all seen this. We've all been to school. You know that after a certain amount of time, your teacher is going to give you an exam or to give you a quiz to see, okay, so you say you're learning, but let's see how much you've actually learned. And then as we go through on our report cards, we can see the progress that we've made, right? So as God tests our character, it's an opportunity for us to look back on the previous opportunities that we've had and see the progress that we're making. Isn't that incredible? Now, character is really just the accumulation of good habits, right? And good habits come from good decisions. Good decisions come from good thoughts. Now, remember how I said that the center of my life determines the character of my life? Now, if you make Jesus the center of your life, and if you spend time with him in prayer and in Scripture and in spending time with his church, then he will begin to change your thoughts, right? Whatever we think about the most is at the center of our life. And if Jesus is at the center of our life, we will be thinking about him the most. And from those good thoughts will come good decisions. From those good decisions will come good habits. And from your good habits will come good character. Jesus' character, right? So in summary, life is too short for us to do everything. And so we need to focus our lives in order that we can make the maximum contribution according to what God's will is for us. And we do this by making Christ the center of our lives and by allowing him as that center to change our character to reflect his character. Now, let me pray for us really quickly. Father, we thank you. We know that our lives are loaded up with a lot of different things, but we thank you that you have sent your Son as our example, that as the center of our lives, he will put everything else in order. And as we spend time dwelling in him and thinking on the things of your word, we will find our character being changed as well. And we thank you so much for that, Lord. In your name we pray.